Good evening, and welcome to Doctorpiece Theater. My name is Dr. Dennis Business, and tonight we will complete our dive into This Is Why I Hate You. When we last left our hero, I believe he had just murdered 2 of his fellow airmen. Maybe 3. I don't think it matters at this point. Chapter 24. For my dearest friend. At this point, you might be wondering how I could possibly write this much in my journal after this happened. How did I suffer a fatal blow and live to write this? I didn't. I'm able to write this because I'm not Arthur Lindfeld. Arthur Lindfeld died before the last entry was even written. My best friend, the most important person in my life, spent his last moments doing everything he could to save us from those men. Arthur loved us to the very end. I think it's important you understand why I'm completing Arthur's journal for him. For some time now, he shared all the details of his life with me. The more he talked about his views on the world, the more I felt like I was listening to myself. His loathing of other people, his hatred for his parents, his willingness to only select a few others in. Arthur and I were each other's home, our sanity. The difference between the two of us is I'm not a leader. He is. Many call me a survivor in the sense that I avoid conflict. I worry about upsetting people, and I normally avoid trouble when it's an option. Arthur was very different in that sense. He never cared about who he upset. He had no filter, and I loved him for that. He was honest and fought for everything he stood for till his last breath. I'm finishing this journal because I know it's what Arthur wanted. It's not just some assumption on my end. Being in the military makes you think of death a lot. When you can be deployed at any moment, you tend to think about what happens after you die. Arthur instructed me to do a couple things if he died. One of them was to give this journal an ending, and another was to look out for Rachel. Arthur was always so confident in me. It's taken me a long time to make both these wishes come true. Almost a year, actually. But they have. Rachel now lives with me in San Diego, California. We have a dog and are hoping to adopt a child someday. We want to name our adopted son after Arthur. We are all imperfect, but Arthur leaned towards the better side of imperfection. Maybe one day our little Arthur will grow up to be just like him, remaining true, no matter the opposition. Arthur, always doing what he thinks is right, even if it means losing it all. Something Arthur never mentioned in this journal is why exactly he hated his father so much. He gave you reasons, but left out the biggest one. I need to include this, as a lot of people might never read this, and they may truly understand Arthur if I don't. Arthur's father was abusive. Every other thing Arthur ever said about his father was directly associated with his childhood. He didn't just hate his father for moving on from his mother so soon. He didn't just hate his father for wanting him to be something he was not. Arthur hated his father because his father repeatedly violated him when his mother was asleep. Arthur hadn't even reached puberty when it began. The abuse went on for years. The fact that Arthur didn't kill his father for what he did to him is beyond me. If someone abused a loved one of Arthur's like his father abused him, nothing would have stopped him from enacting his version of justice in the most violent way possible. Arthur told me he couldn't remember much of this, but when he went to the therapist Lieutenant Colonel Haas sent him to, some of the information came out of him. When he admitted parts of what had happened, he began to understand why he always imagined his father's face when he physically hurt someone. Arthur told me how much he enjoyed seeing the trainer... Arthur told me how much he enjoyed seeing the trainer in the red man suit suffer when he broke his ankle. Even killing the man who was trying to violate Rachel must have been a reflection of what he wanted to do to his father. I wrote about his last moments in the manner he would have written them. I understand his anger. We've both suffered at the hands of others. We both wanted to make things right. He means to accomplish peace. His means to accomplish peace weren't as important to him. Nevertheless, Arthur always liked to transition from casual journal to story mode. So I'll tell you about what happened just after Arthur passed from my perspective. As I kneeled before the bodies, I clutched my blood-soaked head. Watching my best friend die at the hands of Austin was the hardest thing I ever had to go through. In movies, people often die right away, but Arthur gently shook on the ground. He was still blinking. His eyes looked off towards the wall as if he was looking at his own ghost. It was a stare unlike anything I had seen. Immediately after Austin delivered the final blow to Arthur, he screamed, "You should have known! You should have stayed in your place! You should have stayed! You!" He was barely functioning. The knife was still stuck in his head. While Austin was able to survive Arthur's blade, he remained completely blind. Austin clearly couldn't even process that there was a knife stuck in his head. He seemed to only recognize his struggles to speak. His brain damage seemed so severe I don't even think he knew he was blind. As Rachel and I crawled towards Arthur, Austin stumbled out to the hallway where he quickly passed out. There were more dying bodies in the immediate vicinity than living ones at this point. Rachel kept kissing Arthur on the side of the face, saying, "Thank you, Arthur. I love you. I love you, Arthur." I wrapped my arms around Arthur's body, hugging him, soaking his legs in my tears and blood. I didn't have the strength to share any loving words like Rachel. I could only cry as he faded away. The police finally arrived to our room. Someone must have called in all the screaming. One of the two cops was clearly mortified by what he was seeing. Imagine looking upon two girls, one wearing what was left of her torn and bloody clothes. You then realize that they're both holding a man with a hatchet in the back of his head. Beside them is another man with a butchered throat by the base of the bed. The most disturbing of all, the boy with half his skull caved in by the heater in our room. It must have been a sight. I couldn't say much for what I personally saw, as my head wound distorted my perception a bit. The blood in my eyes didn't help either. It didn't take long for the more experienced officer on scene to figure out what happened. He asked, "Is this all of them?" I didn't respond. I just held Arthur in silence. Rachel was unable to speak over her crying, but she was able to reply to the officer with a nod. The officer asked, "Is the beat-up guy outside part of all of this?" He must have been talking about Jacobs, but neither of us had the strength to respond to this officer any further. After everything that happened inside that building, 3 people died and 3 people survived, one of the survivors being the very same person who tried to violate Rachel. We were told that the knife that plunged into Austin's head wasn't enough to kill him like Arthur intended. The blade scraped the side of his skull until it pierced completely through the side of Austin's skull. This was why he struggled to pull it back out and resorted to killing Asher with bare hands. Because of our testimonies, Austin is locked away to this day. He was put in a facility that deals with disabled criminals. We were just grateful. He at least can be nowhere near any woman anytime soon. Rachel was honorably discharged shortly after the rape. The military could have done a lot more to help us, but we were just glad to be free. We never had to go back there or see those people ever again. Arthur was buried in a military graveyard. Many people called him a murderer, others a hero. Whatever he is to the world, to me, he will always be the only man I ever loved. But wait, there's more. About the author. It doesn't matter. Oh my God. Fuck you, book. Fuck. Oh. We have a lot to talk about. But there's one thing that we have to do before that. We made it this far, and we wouldn't be able to drag these through the mud if we didn't have the whole picture. But we can talk about that another time, because this has been Doctorpiece Theater, and my name is Dr. Dennis Business. And as always, the bravest friends I've ever had.